but I was listening to this person talk about headless way, just the really basic headless way exercise. As I was driving, it just spontaneously happened that I had the shift that the person was talking about. And I almost crashed my car. I had to stop and snap out of it and say, all right, wait, let me get myself home. And I got myself home and then it was like, okay, what was that again? Let me look for that again. And I looked for it again and it clicked. And that experience, just that sort of, it was like a, I don't know, 40-minute loss of self and a kind of like just open spaciousness in which phenomena were arising, but in a deconstructed way. So this kind of sensory phenomena was arising here, and this other kind, like a visual phenomenon was arising here, and a body sensation phenomena was arising over here, and an auditory phenomena was arising over here, and they weren't constructed together to create an object.
Welcome to the Endless Possibilities Podcast, where the journey of spiritual awakening and energy healing unfolds.
Hello and welcome to the Endless Possibilities Podcast. My name is Gareth Duignam and I'm your host today for another amazing interview and podcast with another very exciting guest, Dr. Pierce Salguero. Let me give Pierce a quick introduction. Pierce is an author, researcher, teacher, fan, and critic of Buddhism, Asian medicine, and contemporary spirituality. Pierce is an expert in the global connections between Buddhism and medicine throughout history and today. For the past 20 plus years, Pierce has provided tools and support for contemporary spiritual teachers and practitioner communities who are interested in exploring the historical, philosophical, and comparative contexts of their practice. He also has a special interest in meditation sickness and other spiritual emergencies. He is the author of 3 books, A Lamp Unto Yourself, Buddhish, and A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. Okay, Pierce, welcome back for part 2. Thank you for being
Hi.
here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me back. I'm happy to continue with part 2.
Yeah, well, I think we kind of left out a little bit in part 1. We had good intentions of covering it, but we just kind of we got to the end of your model and it just the rest of it kind of just fizzled out of our minds. So we'll come back and revisit it. So today we're going to visit a little bit about your bit of your background, Pierce, and your awakening story.
Yeah.
How would you like to get started on that?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I think most importantly for me in terms of a starting point is just to say that, given what I was talking about last time that we met about the real differences between people when it comes to the awakening process and these different threads or trajectories of development that can open but don't always open for everybody. People might be working down different threads and have different kinds of phenomenology, different kinds of insights, different kinds of experiences. And then we talked about the braiding of those threads together and their integration in very unique ways. And I think that there's a real difference between people there. I mean, there's a huge amount of difference between people there in terms of how these threads braid together and how people integrate things. And that leads to a really wide range of different kinds of awakening experiences that people have. One person might say that they had, 3 or 4 different phases of braiding. Other people might say they had 35 different phases, right? What they experience in what order and
Yeah.
how they experience it, all of that's different. And then the psyche thread, if that's involved, we talked about all the different kinds of ways that that can show up for people, and people will have just radically different worldviews and interpretations that they'll be putting on all of this material. And so I just think when people are telling their story, it's really their story. It's really just their own, it says everything about their own unique psychological process, their own unique interpretations of these events, and it doesn't really tell us very much at all about how it should be for anybody else other than that one person. And I think what happens is that people latch on to other people's awakening stories and then think mine should look like that. And to me, that kind of thinking is just one of the largest, most fundamental problems within spirituality more generally, is that people are trying to model their own process after other people and trying to match other people's experiences. So I'm usually reluctant to talk about my own experiences for that reason, because it's my experiences are not a model for anybody else. They're not normative for what spirituality should look like. It's just one person's idiosyncratic experiences of their
Sure,
own psyche, right? Of their own
sure.
mental process. And I just don't want people to get fixated on, my experience or me as an individual. And I'd rather, I mean, if it can be in some way kind of illustrative of the model and just kind of how something might
Sure.
hold, then that's helpful. But if it's going to become a thing where
Yeah.
people fixated on their process not looking like mine, then I think it's actually counterproductive. So, yeah, so
Okay.
my kind of caveats around that conversation.
Okay, so maybe we'll give a little disclaimer that this is Pierce's awakening story, right? And nobody else's. But I mean, there are some significant signposts that happen for people along the way, right? There's some, like the emptiness, the self-realization, the unity, and a lot of people do kind of share. Like there was books I read, and it was definitely I was like, okay, yes, that's happening to me, ticking all the boxes. God consciousness, yes, ticking all the boxes. But I hadn't yet got to unity consciousness, and I was reading about it. I was like, no, it just I'm not experiencing that yet. So yeah, it was helpful for me a little bit to read other people's.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, so yeah, so if it's helpful, then I can talk a little bit about it. Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, we won't dwell on it, right? We'll just because I have a few questions I want to come back on
Yeah.
over the treads model. So,
Sure.
m- where would you like to start?
I I guess I should say, I mean, in terms of like awakening kind of experiences and so forth, I should probably say that I grew up very interested in spirituality and religion from a very early age. I was reading like the Upanishads when I was like 13, and other kinds of Aldous Huxley and other kinds of, awakening type literature from a very early age, and became fascinated by religions and spirituality, and I started taking courses in that in high school and in college, and started doing all kinds of other things to sort of explore the possibilities of consciousness, and majored in cognitive science and anthropology, where I studied, these things from different disciplines. So it's just always been something that
Hmm.
has been percolating for me as an area of interest, both intellectually, trying to understand, the histories and the different philosophies and so forth, but then also practices, and just trying all sorts of different practices from back in my teenage days, and having all kinds of different experiences. I guess I'm somebody whose psychology is wired up in a way that I'm kind of prone towards having sometimes rather flamboyant experiences, some, sometimes more subtle, but yeah, just having all kinds of different responses to the kinds of practices that I was involved in from a very early age. So that's kind of my background. Mostly interested in my training, my kind of more theoretical, historical, academic kind of knowledge has been mostly around Asian forms of spirituality, particularly Buddhism, but others as well. But my own practice background started in my as a teenager, working with Native American, Indigenous American practices. I trained with a Lakota Sioux medicine man when I was 14 or 15 to do sweat lodges. And
I hope you are enjoying the show with Pierce. This is just a quick request. If you have not already signed up, please, 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 can you subscribe to our channel? It goes towards showing YouTube that we are a worthwhile show and they push us out to new audiences through the algorithm. So if you want to continue to enjoy great conversations like the one you're watching now, please support us. Hit subscribe. Now back to the show.
And
I've done a sweat lodge.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they're difficult.
Yeah, and I was learning all the songs and learning how to tend the fire and so forth, and got into, some neo-pagan stuff at that age, and yeah, and then I went off into the Asian traditions. And one thing I never really got into was the Western traditions, even though my family is from South America, Latino family. I should have been exposed to a lot of Catholicism or to other kinds of, Western traditions, and I wasn't. So, yeah, so it's really been kind of like a wide-ranging exploration ever since I was young of all of these different kind of things, and had various types of experiences, in different areas for a very long time. Yeah, so maybe that's kind of the starting point is breadth, not focus, breadth.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I got super into Buddhist meditation after I graduated from college and was a serious meditator doing a lot of Theravada Buddhist meditation, so Vipassana meditation and concentration meditation in retreat style, silent retreats for 10 days or 30 days at a time.
Wow.
And funny enough, I never really, for me, it was a real struggle. I never really kind of, given all the other sorts of experiences and kinds of, reading that I had done, and I was expecting a lot out of meditation when I went into it. And maybe that's part of the problem was the expectations that I had there. But for me, it was a real struggle to do a concentration style practice. That was never something that I took very easily to. And I kind of beat my head against that wall for about 5 years that I was doing the circuit I was living in Southeast Asia. I was spending a lot of time in monasteries and meditation retreat centers and so forth, and not really kind of getting anywhere with that. And I wound up in a monastery, kind of having a conversation with a monk there, complaining a little bit about, or I guess asking for advice about sort of what to do, because I had been kind of immersed in this, concentration style meditation and was really kind of like really doing the whole lifestyle really very seriously, and really struggling with it and not having any kind of effect. The predicted effects that you should be able to go into different kinds of jhanas, and you should, develop concentration in a certain kind of way. I've been doing it for 5 years, nothing was happening. And the monk gave me what turned out to be some extremely helpful advice. He just told me why don't I just relax and go do some Metta Bhavana meditation instead? And Metta Bhavana is just tapping into loving kindness and sort of like spreading love around, and saturating your mind in love and kindness and
Mm.
wishing it for others. And so I was at this monastery for a couple months. I was sort of doing a retreat. I had intended to do this concentration meditation retreat, but after talking with this monk, I thought, okay, why don't I give that a try? And so I just did sort of, the basic, super basic loving kindness meditation for, at a pretty high dosage, several hours a day. My job was to sweep the path. It was a forest monastery, and the leaves in the forest fall on the path, and little insects and stuff get under there. So my job during the day was just to sweep the paths clean. And by the time you're done sweeping the path, more leaves had fallen behind you
Yeah.
to turn around and go back and sweep them all up again. So I just spent hours a day sweeping bugs off of the path, and just in my mind doing this loving kindness meditation, maybe well, maybe happy, maybe well, maybe happy. And in a couple of weeks, I had a huge kind of heart opening experience there.
Pierce, can I just jump in really quick? Can we use your treads model as you're going through the awakening, right? Can we piece it all together and
Yeah, so that's kind of where I was going with that.
okay, good.
So so what I've just explained is somebody who's kind of like drawn towards spirituality, doesn't really kind of know what they're doing per se, but has a lot of sort of, breadth and diversity in the kinds of approaches and feels like there's something there. And then I latched onto the emptiness thread style practices, right? This Vipassana meditation, Buddhist style meditation is an emptiness style practice, and really kind of like dedicated a lot of time to that for many years, and really struggled with that and didn't really get anywhere with it.
Mm.
And then, as I explained, I kind of was guided to shift over into a more heart-based, oneness-based kind of practice, and practice that for a couple of weeks, and suddenly had this huge heart-opening experience, right? So the point of the story is to not get latched onto one particular thread or one particular direction, but to really sort of, you know, if you're just dabbling around, you're not really going to find you're not going to really find anything to be very effective. But when you want to put effort into opening up a thread, I think what I advise people to do now is to sort of spread yourself across the four threads and do some practices that involve all four of them so that you can see what's going to open up for you. Because if I spent 5 years in that Theravada Buddhist context, I could have maybe spent, I don't know. Maybe something eventually would have happened, but I feel like I could have spent decades practicing that and not gotten anywhere with it, but then shifted over to oneness practice, and suddenly I'm having these like, huge kind of, heart-opening oneness kind of experiences just from a couple of weeks of serious practice.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of Adyashanti with the Zen sitting in front of a wall for years on end and getting completely frustrated. Maybe he was just on the wrong path, right?
I mean,
Or the
that's
wrong thread.
my argument, right? So I do think that people, should sort of approach spiritual training like athletic training. Some people might be destined to be Olympic level swimmers, and those people should get in the pool and start swimming from an early age, and they'll just take to it and they'll be amazing. But most of us probably are better served just to, develop general health and well-being and strength. But most of us are probably better served in some kind of cross training where we're doing some swimming, but also some weightlifting and also some, yoga and also some other things or whatever, whatever kind of balanced health fitness activities. Then that'll serve most of us better. And that's just kind of the argument that I'm making when it comes to spirituality too, is that we're modeling our practice after Olympic level athletes of spirituality, right? We all want to be Ramana Maharshi, or we all
Yeah.
want to be, whoever the ideal that we have in our minds are, and we're sort of, doing practice in that mold. Whereas really what I think we should be focused on for most people is kind of exploratory practice, doing a bunch of different practices. You have to do it at a certain level of intensity to see, what's there, but doing kind of a broader, more balanced style in order to open things up
And
naturally.
then when you find what's most suited for you, then you go all in on that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. So you had the heart opening, and then what, Pierce? What transpired from the
Well, I kind of went all in on that, like you were
you
saying.
went and
Yeah, so I have had a I had a yoga practice that I was doing, physical exercise based yoga practice for, at this point, I've done it daily for over 30 years.
oh
So
wow.
that's been kind of there as well. But the sort of heart opening practice that kind of happened there just led me down a path of getting into compassion-based practices for about 20 years. I spent a long time just really kind of, not focused on any kind of emptiness practices at all, still within the Buddhist kind of orbit, but much more focused on compassion, on the compassion side of Buddhism, much more focused on Mahayana Buddhism, which talks about, compassion as one of the main kind of principles of Buddhism. So, and I sort of went all in with that. I decided to go get a PhD and really focused around Chinese Buddhism and the practices of health and healing in that tradition. I spent, decades in both in graduate school and then afterwards researching and studying the history of Chinese Buddhism and its relationship with healing. That's what all my academic publications are about. So I just sort of like went all in on that, both in terms of practice, but then also in terms of sort of organizing my life around really diving into that particular thread. Yeah, and I did that for quite happily. I did that for 20 years, and then some additional shifts started happening kind of spontaneously, and that sort of opened up some of the other threads for me.
And Pierce, did you have any sort of a like a pr mm, did you know what was coming, right? Did you understand that there was an unfoldment of consciousness, and did you have an idea that you were sort of on a pathless path, that there was further stages unfolding for you?
I think during that time period, the time period where it was just about sort of like compassion, open-heartedness, it was very, very ordinary kind of daily life sorts of manifestations or embodiment of compassion. I wasn't really interested, or I wasn't really seeking out or really interested in kind of like, dramatic experiences or developing sort of levels of consciousness or anything like
Yeah.
that. I just was quite happy to just be, an ordinary person, just a kind, ordinary person in the world, just sort of being, practicing, learning how to be more gentle, how to be more altruistic, how to be more impactful in my daily life with people, just sort of trying to just be a good person and not really kind of imagining all kinds of different levels of consciousness or development. I think that's one of the kind of principles I picked up from that form of Buddhism, from Mahayana Buddhism, which is really sort of, I mean, there are, of course, cultivation practices that can really propel you forward in an awakening process, but there's also teachings around just sort of like forget about awakening, just be a kind person and go about your business. And I was
So
more on that side of things.
humility, you were cultivating humility, being small.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I also was trying to get ahead in my career, so I was publishing, things and trying to sort of like be established as a scholar. So yes, humility in terms of like spiritual humility. Like my goal
Yes.
isn't to become some kind of, you know, exalted figure. It's just to be an ordinary person in the world, and to do that in the kindest way possible. I was
Mm,
raising a family. I was a teacher. I had my university students, and just this was the arena in which I was practicing just being a good person, right? In the world.
mm,
Yeah, and so during that time there were I still had the propensity to have these kinds of sort of more flamboyant types of experiences. So I still would have occasionally some kind of unusual, spiritual experience. And sometimes those had an energetic kind of quality to them, certain things that would happen with my yoga practice, or I also had a healing practice before I became an academic. I did traditional medicine, Thai medicine, and so there's a lot of kind of energy work, and I would have sort
mm,
of experiences there working in Thailand with part of my both my healing practice, but then also my research involved working with, you might call them shamans or traditional spirit healers in Thailand, and I would occasionally have a kind of a sort of an experience there, with entities or with spirits and so forth. So there would be little kind of little sparks every once in a while that would kind of like, go off, but none of it really amounted to like a thread, like what I would call a thread. There was sort of this very, very, very slow heart opening taking place. So that was a thread, but the other ones were just sort of like epiphenomenal for a long time.
mm. And did you get drawn into the phenomena? Did like I mean, when they started happening, did you go, I want more of them? Did like one of the things when people talk about awakening, right? It's the cities, and a lot of teachers will say, don't get involved with the cities, or just witness them, let them happen, and don't chase after them. Did you find yourself wanting to have more of them, or
I mean, some of them I was a little bit scared of, to be honest, like the stuff that involved spirits and things like that. I would kind of hold that at an arm's length, even though I would have some of those experiences. I'd be like, oh, I don't want to go into that world. Like I had a sort of a, you know,
like an astral thing opening up, or
yeah, I mean, mostly it was mostly what would happen occasionally. I would sort of like experience the presence of an entity or something. There would be
yeah,
some kind
yeah.
of possession ritual taking place that I was participating in Thailand. I was observing there as an anthropologist or as a scholar, observing people becoming possessed by these entities, and then I would
Wow.
feel like, oh, there's something trying to come into me, something like that. And so I would sort of try to keep all of that at arm's length and just kind of not get too involved in those kinds of things personally. Well, I was more comfortable being an observer than a full-on participant in those kinds of events, but I could see
I
that there was something wanting to happen there that I,
Yeah.
that I was afraid of. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's there is phenomena, right? And when some of the awakenings open up, that phenomena can come in, and you can. I think what happens is if you choose to put your attention on it and invite it in, well, then it can become a thread, right? You can really go down that avenue and becoming, engulfed in it.
Right.
Whereas you kind of go, okay, interesting, but I'm not getting pulled in. I'll just watch it, notice it,
Yep. So I was
and
very, very interested in it academically,
yeah,
intellectually, right? Let me understand how other people explain this. Let me understand how other people think about this and, how they think about it in China and, 1,000 years ago and how they thought about it in Japan and, just very kind of like keep it at an arm's length, keep it intellectual, keep it, safe because it might be scary. It might be weird and
okay,
just sitting in my sort of like in my uh, very 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 slowly kind of like opening heart and just kind of that was the one kind of area that made sense for me that was a kind of a deepening over time,
okay. So on your model, you were well and truly on your thread of oneness.
but a very 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 slow and
Okay,
very gradual opening there. Yeah,
okay, and any
maybe
of
it
the
was
other
an opening and
threads.
just a very gradual deepening, I guess is what that was. Yeah.
Oh, okay, and the psychic phenomena that was kind of presented itself. Did
All of it, I would say, was epiphenomenal, not a thread, just kind of
Okay,
like little glimpses, little like simmering, little sort of like, glistening, but not yet a thread.
okay, okay,
And that was a pretty stable situation for, a couple decades, for about 20, just less than 20 years, just sort of stable with that kind of thing. Yeah, and then it's like Pandora's box got opened up at some point, and so for me there was like a sudden kind of drastic shift in perspective or shift in consciousness that took place at a certain point in time, which would kick off a series of openings that and braidings that kind of like launched, what you might call an awakening process, and then it sort of like was explosive and rather short in terms of the run of the whole process. And it started with an opening of what I would say an opening of the emptiness thread with this kind of shift in perspective one day. As I was driving home from work, I was listening to a podcast and had somebody on the podcast that was kind of leading a little exercise in headless way, which is
mm,
a technique of kind of turning the awareness back towards itself. And, it has nothing to do with Buddhism, it has nothing to do with Asian religions. And I guess the way that it was being said, I had heard pointers, from Buddhism to non-self and to other kinds of realizations. I'd heard those kinds of pointers before many, many, many times, but I think I was able to intellectualize them because of my scholarly background, was able to sort of like, turn any kind of Buddhist instructions into an intellectual project because of my academic background and all the reading that I'd done. But this was something really fresh, really different, really kind of like quirky and weird, and talked about things in a way that I hadn't ever sort of, heard before. But it is a pointing it out instruction. It is very, in that sense, very similar to a sort of Tibetan style or Japanese style, pointing instruction. But I was listening to this person talk about headless way, just the really basic headless way exercise. As I was driving, it just sort of spontaneously happened that I had the shift, that the person was talking about. And I almost like crashed my car. I had to I had to stop and sort of snap out of it and say, "All right, wait, let me get myself home." And I got myself home, and then it was like, "Okay, what was that again? Let me look for that again." And I sort of like looked for it again, and it kind of like clicked. And that experience, just that sort of, it was like a, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minute kind of loss of self, and a kind of like just open spaciousness in which phenomena were arising, but in a deconstructed way. So this kind of sensory phenomena was arising here, and this other kind, like a visual phenomenon, was arising here, and a body sensation phenomena was arising over here, and an auditory phenomena was arising over here, and they weren't constructed together to create an object. They were all actually, normally I would have seen all of those accumulated together as an object, but now they were just in this deconstructed kind of fashion, and they're just sort of all appearing scattered and randomly within a spacious kind of void. And I wasn't able to find a self, or sort of like an organizing principle, or kind of like a sort of a container for those kinds of phenomena. Just sort of the whole thing, the whole phenomenal field just sort of dissolved, I guess, into kind of a more sort of chaotic and disintegrated kind of, sort of like stardust kind of, and so that was a pretty intense experience. It kind of normalized again. I came back to my sort of ordinary way of seeing things. It was like, what was that? And that launched me on the journey to sort of like going down the emptiness thread, having experienced disintegration like that. And this actually, what it turns out, my own kind of way of things unfolding is for me to have more dramatic experiences, and then kind of come back out of them, and then sort of like gradually then try to find my way back to having that level of experience. So that's how I tend to, now I know that's how I worked down the threads, was to sort of like jump ahead and then retreat and then go back down slowly. So this was like a pretty deep emptiness thread experience. And then I was back in my normal kind of way of seeing things. And then I spent 6 months or so, maybe a little bit longer, trying to like find my way back to that experience. And there was a lot of kind of striving, and a lot of kind of like, let me try to meditate my way back to there, or let me try to like, see things in a certain way to get back to there. So there was a lot of, doing and striving and so forth to to move forward. But that was very much within the framework of my Buddhist kind of background. I know that there's techniques, I know that there's practices. Let me put those practices into place to try to sort of like, because I recognized what I had seen as being a Buddhist insight, and I wanted to sort of like put the practices into place to get back to that place.
And Pierce, do you think that the way you were wired, you had to have them flashy experiences? Like some people, they can kind of like gradually, progress or deepen their experience, whereas others, including myself, it was bells and whistles, like,
Yeah.
flashy openings, then sitting with them, trying to intellectually understand them, right? It's like reading up about it. And I wonder, could you talk a little bit about both, like having the realization and then having an intellectual understanding? Because it seems people can have a shift in awareness, but unless they can intellectualize it,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to fully flower as an awakening until we can somehow put it in a framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that experience, I recognized it like while it was happening or immediately after it was happening. I was clear, oh, this is what I have read about in Buddhist context. This is a kind of experience that I know, that I
Classic self-realization
know
or
exists. Well, not non-self, I guess in Buddhist
yeah,
concept, the dropping away of the self and
yes.
and yeah, the field of phenomena arising with no self organizing it or even really witnessing it. That something that I had read about, that was something that I sort of understood, from a Buddhist framework. Now, I don't know. I mean, some Buddhists might argue with me that that wasn't actually, what this Buddhist text described or whatever. Maybe they're right, but for me, I thought I recognized it as being something that had a Buddhist that I could understand using Buddhism, let's say. And so I had a framework, but I think if I had not had a framework for that kind of experience, who knows what I would have thought. If I didn't have any kind of spiritual framework whatsoever, I most likely would have thought that I was having a brain aneurysm or some kind of, some kind of mental
Yeah.
illness or something. I might have gone and had my eyes checked. I don't know what I would have thought had I not had that context. The other thing is, if I had had a spiritual context, but not a emptiness thread context, not a Buddhist context for understanding this. Let's say I was, I don't know, Catholic, Christian. I understand that spirituality is supposed to be oneness with God, but suddenly I'm having this kind of disintegrated experience of reality that is very kind of. I think it would have been very disorienting. I think it may have been interpreted. I might have interpreted it as something's wrong, something,
Mm.
something's broken. So yeah, I do think context. I think context and being able to frame your experiences, like you were saying, in within a context is super, super, super valuable. And it's one of the reasons why now I'm deciding to talk about things publicly because, yeah, because I think these things should be much more kind of out in the open. Than people don't have to be, don't have to think that they would just have more possibility for contextualizing experiences when they happen spontaneously. I guess
Yeah.
if I was in a monastery practicing meditation, still when this happened, I would have had lots of support around me. Lots of people know what this is all about, and they might have, given me that kind of context, even if I didn't know so much about Buddhist doctrine. But people are having these kinds of experiences out there, never read anything about Buddhism, don't really understand what's happening, don't have a practice framework, don't have a community that knows about these things, then it can be quite, I think, disorienting and
I,
problematic.
I I think it's super helpful if just a little bit of reassurance. For instance, I had a woman in one of my groups the other evening who started talking about Kriyas and she didn't know what was going on. And I told her that it was perfectly normal. And the relief that came over her, she was just like, oh my God, I could see nearly tears welling up in her eyes. That what she was experiencing was okay and it was seen as normal in this group, right? It was like, oh, okay, great, and it just totally put our mind at ease. So I think you having a model, the Treads model, people can go, "Oh, okay, I understand what's happening. It puts my mind at ease."
Yeah, yeah. So I did not have the Threads model at the time. So
Yeah,
that's something that I created retrospectively after the whole process was finished, and then I could
yeah,
sort of see how all these pieces fit together. But yeah, but so far I had a model. So far I was like, okay, the Theravada Buddhist model, this model that I used to sort of subscribe to and used to practice with can help me to make sense of this. No problem.
And
Continue onwards and deepen into it. And yeah, so
did that model cover the energy thread though?
no. So
No.
that's
Yeah,
what
that's what I
happened
thought.
next.
Yeah,
So that's what happened next. So about 6 months, so I sort of went back to doing the kinds of meditation that I used to do 20 years ago, in order to sort of like cultivate and deepen into this experience that I had had. And it was happening, it was deepening, things were progressing. I don't need to get maybe into the details there, but or
sure.
maybe I do, but you can come back to it if you want to. But the next thing that happened was about 6 months later, while sort of deepening into the emptiness thread, I started having Kundalini kinds of energy rushes in the body. So the initial wave of Kundalini experience felt sort of like an uprising, sort of tingling, kind of like fizzling kind of sensation, like sort of like coming up through the top of my head, and as that sort of experientially sort of started to happen, it kind of showed me again this disintegrated, kind of separated perception that I had experienced before. But now, instead of kind of discrete sensory phenomena within the field, right? So there's like the hearing and the seeing and the body sensations arising in the field. Instead of those being discrete, now everything just kind of like became fizzly, kind of like old TV sets that had that snow where everything's just like
Hmm.
all sort of like flitting around like that. So essentially, like the Kundalini came up and just like dissolved like all of reality into like that sort
A
of.
field of Shakti, would you say?
Yeah. So that experience again, it was like this 30, 40 minute kind of experience, maybe a little bit longer experience, which showed me sort of like a deeper point on the energy thread. And then, I I came back out of it and it's just like everything's just normal, back to normal. And I sort of like worked my way down towards that again. But so over time, over months now, I sort of like realigned my project from working with Theravada Buddhist meditation to a combination of Theravada Buddhist meditation with some of the yoga kind of techniques that I knew, because in my mind I recognized Kundalini as being something that was talked about in the yoga tradition. So then I brought the yoga tools to bear on the practice. So now I was doing kind of both Theravada Buddhist meditation and then also these yoga practices, kind of a little bit at odds with one another for different
Mm,
reasons. One is more to sort of like more perceptual. The other one is more sort of like energetic, but the two were complementary, working together.
yeah.
So I sort of like, in my model, in the language of my model, you can say like I opened a second thread and now had two different sets of tools to work down both threads at the same time. And they were doing a little bit of braiding, sort of like the energetic stuff would become more prominent, and then the more deconstruction would become more prominent, right? So they sort of like oscillated a little bit like that.
To me, it sounds like a positive, right?
So far, yeah.
A greater tool set.
Yeah. So far I understood what was happening. I knew I had the tools. I knew from these two traditions, I had the tools to work with it. This was great. Like everything's, quite positive. Yeah.
Pierce, did you have any inclination that the daily yoga practice you had for 25 years had been in preparation for this energetic phenomena that was moving through your
I
body? And
mean,
by the sounds of it, it sounded like it went really smoothly, right? So,
that's what made sense to me in that moment. I thought, oh, I've done, these practices for so long. It's just kind of like a preparation, really good preparation for what's happening now, or set the ground for what's happening now to be smooth and positive, and yeah.
it sounds like it was. It just
Yeah.
slid on up there, right? It just
Yeah.
didn't hit into blockages. You didn't have any Kundalini crisis going on.
Not at that moment.
Okay, 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 maybe something came later.
Yeah, so everything's going really smooth, everything's going really great. I think like, oh, this is amazing. I'm making so much spiritual progress. This is all fantastic, super positive. Yeah, and then the bottom fell out, which was for me, I now would call this the opening of the psyche thread. But the kind of yeah, like a year into the awakening process now. And I was seeing it as an awakening process. I was understanding it
Hmm.
as like, oh, this is what people talk about as awakening.
Yeah.
These are the tools that I have to work towards awakening. I thought it was great. I thought everything was, under control. Everything was, moving along really positively. And then the sort of the bottom fell out on the whole thing. And with the psyche thread opening up. So for me, the opening of the Psyche thread was very dramatic. Again, like always, dramatic and overwhelming and bells and whistles and all of that.
So what
Uh,
was turning up, Pierce? Phenomena?
so for me, it was like my so it involved a second wave of Kundalini. And this time Kundalini was still physical. It still was a energetic, somatic kind of sensory thing happening in the body. But it also was accompanied by a whole lot of extremely dark imagery. And the way it felt was like the gates of hell opened up and like everything came out and it sort of like poured through
Mhm.
my body. So for me, it involved a lot of demonic imagery, a lot of really sort of like dark entities, a lot of, spirit entity type stuff.
Yeah.
And I could see that the message from the very beginning, the message was, the so sorry, I earlier I said it was the gates of hell opened up and everything came out, but it was also like the heavens opened up and shone down light, and they were both happening simultaneously. So it was like intense visions, intense sort of, sometimes in dreams, but a lot of mostly just kind of while being awake, if I close my eyes, just suddenly having these kind of visions, entities, all sorts of experiences, both of the darkness coming up and also of lightness coming down. And this was where all the context that I had, all the frameworks that I had, all the sort of like nicely packaged, oh, this fits into Theravada Buddhism and this one fits into yoga, and I just do these practices and so forth, that all of that fell apart. And it was
Yeah.
just like you sort of out of control. And I was pretty sure I was probably having a psychological breakdown of some sort, but I fortunately I had the background in indigenous practices from when I was a teenager, and I had read enough about shamanism and other kinds of spirit-based practices. I'd been exposed to all of that stuff through my time in Thailand and through my studies of Asian history. So I knew about the whole range of sort of spirit-based practices and stuff like that. So I had tools, and I was
Good.
I was like, well, probably I've lost my mind, but it seems to be the effects of what was happening were super weird internally, but externally, what I saw happening, all that was happening was I was just becoming more and more present, more and more kind, more and more available, had more capacity for my family, for my work, for my relationships. A lot of like the sticky parts of relationships were becoming more tangled, right? There was a lot of release of, baggage and kind of like
Yeah.
resentments and
Reactivity. Yeah.
reactivity, and all of that was sort of reducing. That's what I was actually seeing in my daily life. And so I just I just was thinking I just thought to myself, okay, I don't, it feels like I'm going crazy, but actually what's happening on the outside is it seems like things are becoming clarified. So let me interpret this as another kind of spiritual awakening. Let me bring my sort of shamanic tools into bear here. And I had to sort of like go and, do some reading and do some experimenting to figure out what would work. But I sort of tried to place these events into a framework that I could work with as well. And so, long story short, I was able to kind of engage with this material and really deepen into it and really explore it and understand it and work with it using these tools from indigenous practices and shamanism. And so now, in the language of the model that I would use today, I would say what I had successfully discovered how to do is, there was an opening of the psyche thread, and I successfully was able to figure out how to work with the psyche thread and deepen into it. So again, it was this experience of like extreme experience and then back to normal, and then sort of like working my way back through the material to sort of process it all and embody it all.
Okay, wow.
And here's a point where I think, yeah, where framework or context was super, super important, being able to have some kind of context for that, because what was happening was pretty extreme, and I think it would have been really extremely difficult to sort of understand or work with if I hadn't been able to, if I didn't have the wherewithal in the previous experience to draw upon, to help with that.
So I we did the interview 2 weeks ago or last week, and when you spoke about the psyche thread, I kind of, I was trying to piece it into my awakening. And before awakening, I had all the out of body phenomena, psychic abilities opened up. And I kind of discarded it. I was like, okay, that opened up early on for me. But I kind of, listening to you speak there, I realized that as I was going through my awakening as well, similar stuff happened. There was a lot of like psychic attacks, beings coming in, energy phenomena, things trying to enter into the backs of my knees at nighttime. There was definitely a psyche thing happening, fairies turning up, but I didn't put them anywhere. There was no model that I was working with. There was no framework. It didn't fit in anywhere. So I just kind of discarded it. It's like, oh, just
Yeah.
psychic phenomena that's coming up. So you think that is part of an awakening
Yeah,
process?
so for me that is all of that is part of the psyche thread. So it can just be epiphenomenal, which is what I was talking about earlier, where it's not really developing into an awakening process. It's just sort of like the stuff happens and it's just kind of, not a big deal, or you keep it at arm's length, or you
Yeah.
sort of, you don't really engage it. And then it's not really a thread. But what I was just talking about now is then that material now sort of presenting itself. In my case, it just presented itself in such a way that I could no longer ignore it or no longer like keep it at bay or just intellectualize it. I had to actually, I had to work with it. I had to go into it. Other people might decide that they want to turn towards it, and then, they're making the decision consciously. For me, it was I just had no choice. I had to work with this. But yeah, at a certain point, those kinds of experiences, I think, can become part of an awakening process, and not just epiphenomenal, but they actually become a field for exploration and depth and deepening, right? So if
Okay.
I need to turn towards these things, you know, what do these experiences have to teach me? What are these experiences trying to show me? What are these, entities or images or whatever?
Yeah.
What is this material trying to, lead me towards? And what I was seeing, I'm giving sort of just like the headline summaries, right? Without getting into all of the
Yeah.
details. But what I was seeing was just that it was all about ac- ac- accepting the full range of unconscious material and conditioning that was here in this body, in this mind, however it was coming out. And sometimes it would look like entities, and sometimes it would
Yeah.
look like, demons, and sometimes it would look like, the heavens opened up and angels were, streaming light down at me. And sometimes it looked like I was the demon or I was the angel, and
Yeah.
it would look like all sorts of different things. But ultimately, in working with it, it really was always about, what aspects have I suppressed and pushed into the shadows? What aspects have I denied? What aspects have I excluded? What aspects have I not fully welcomed and accepted? What aspects have I not been able to embody? And then having the psyche thread work is figuring out how to just welcome all of this into some kind of relationship, into some kind of deeper intimacy and deeper wholeness. And a lot of healing takes
Yeah.
place in that process. A lot of it had to do with past traumas. I think I went through the psyche like sort of levels last time. It's like some of it's biographical trauma, some of it's very early, childhood pre-verbal stuff.
Past life. Yeah.
For me, it went to I had some past life stuff, but the ancestral stuff was a lot more significant. But there was some past life stuff. There was also like very like animalistic, mammalian animal kind of conditioning of the body, right? There's certain urges and impulses and
Yeah.
conditioning around sort of just our mammalian bodies, right? And our animal bodies, that a lot of that came out for me too. It's sort of like deeper and deeper and deeper into the conditioned layers of the body and the stuff in there that is, that the ego doesn't want to see, and that the ego wants to pretend that it's in control of, and wants to pretend that it can
S-
manage. And this
s-
is about all that stuff, sort of like the ego just giving up control, and just recognizing that this stuff cannot be managed, that it has to be welcomed and accepted, that it
Yeah.
has to be, welcome to come forward and just,
So we can't
um,
just transcend. We have to come back in and then work through the human. S-
yeah. So
s-
for me, this whole, so it was like the whole beginning part was transcendence, and then it was
yeah.
like
Coming back in.
down into the body, back down into the body, and then it was like down into the psyche, right? It was like it's like coming back, but like going even further down, right? Like,
So, Pierce, you're the first person that I've heard speak about a second rising of the Kundalini, and I something you said just twigged something with me because I experienced the very same thing, and it just reminded me. So, I had to cut the full Kundalini awakening all the way up into the head, had all the nice feelings, sensations, crown awakening, and a year later. I had what felt like the Kundalini drop back down to the root and rise up as far as the navel, so the lower three chakras. And later I discovered I have her book there. It's called Kundalini Vidya. She talks about Kundalini bypassing the lower three chakras on some of the risings in some people, and it going up, and you kind of attain all the spiritual cities, but the lower three chakras aren't cleared, and then it has to come back down and work on the lower. So that's what happened to me, and that kind of sounds like what you described. If I don't know, maybe.
yeah, I mean, for me, it was, I don't know that I had a, so I did have a kind of a sense of different energy centers in the body, and I don't know that it necessarily matches exactly with, this or that Kundalini model,
Mm,
but was kind of the next thing I was going to lead to, is what in the end, what wound up happening. There was a lot of braiding for me. there
mm,
was there was a lot of, now I'm having an emptiness experience, now I'm having a oneness experience, now I'm having Kundalini, now I'm having energy, now I'm having Psyche, and they're sort of like piling on top of one another, and that sort of became, it just all kind of eventually swirled together. Meanwhile, all the threads are going deeper and deeper and deeper. So I can come back and talk about that if you
yeah.
want. But the kind of the the integration is when all of this sort of like clicks together, and it's you can see the threads are all simultaneously available and fully like functioning as perspectives or as realities. For me, the way that that looked was that I came to sense that my body had four different centers where I could kind of draw the energy into the head, and it would become emptiness. Like reality would become empty, my perception would become empty, but I could then draw energy into the heart space, and reality would become oneness, and my perception would become oneness. My identity also became oneness. I am everything, right? Dropping the energy further down into the abdomen, everything became energetic, and the whole sort of like swirling kind of sparkling kind of field of energy, and then I am nothing but energy. And then I could drop the energy down through the root chakra, down into like an abyss, like below the root chakra, like down into the earth or down into a dark space below the root chakra, and then the whole thing would turn into the psyche thread, right? With all of the sort of like the visual components to it, and I was the darkness and the light, right? I was the embodiment of all of what was in the psyche. So for me, it kind of like integrated into a four energy center sort of like system, I guess, or arrangement. And then I could sort of like move my awareness or move my consciousness or move my energy
Looking out through them, right?
looking out through
Yeah.
four different
So
portals into reality or something like that. So that's what kind of like integration looked like for me
yeah.
was that's how it snapped together. That's not necessarily how it has to snap together for other people. Like they might have a completely different experience of what integration looks like. But for me, it did organize into kind of like a vertical arrangement of energy centers, which maybe you might call chakras, but I think it's my own version of chakras, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think some people talk about awakening from in the head, the heart, and the gut.
I would say
S-
head, heart, gut, and then below that too, like down into the earth, down into the.
Well, it's funny because when I was listening to you, I was like going, yeah, yeah, okay, head. Then it went into the heart for me, and then into the gut. But I had it go above Pierce, right? It felt like it went up above into like a center above my head, and I was perceiving from above the head center, heart center, and but I never experienced the going down into the earth.
I get, yeah, the full thing for me was like light streaming down from the top, right?
Yeah.
And then like darkness coming up from below, and the
Okay.
four centers, right? So the four centers were like the centers of identity and perception, right? I am the void. I am the one. I am, energy. I am, the full integration of light and dark. And then you have the light streaming down and the darkness coming up, to form the full. That for me, that was the full picture. Um,
Okay.
but that's just me, right? There's no reason that anybody else has to look like that or have
Yeah.
that particular kind of notion or model.
Sure.
I'm not here to tell people that that's, how
Right or wrong, right? It's just something
wrong.
you noticed. Okay.
That's what
Okay.
integration looked like for me. The point of integration is not, I think, how it's configured, but whether when somebody is able to snap together into some kind of coherent picture, the threads that they have open, and they're able to sort of like unify them into some kind of system where they then can navigate between those different centers or those different perspectives fluidly, whatever that looks like for you. I think that's integration.
Okay. So I have just a quick question, right? Because I deal with a lot of people, and I hear a lot of people's stories, and I'm just wondering, for someone maybe who's experiencing God turning up as an external, like as an authoritative voice speaking down, Jesus, angels, all that sort of stuff, would you include that in the psyche thread?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me that sounds like so that is not what I mean when I'm talking about oneness and I'm
Yep.
talking about
Yep.
God, the oneness
Yep.
thread. Like there, I think it's more like Brahman. It's more like the I don't you have a particular way you use that term. Never mind. Forget I said that. It's more like it's more like, I am one with the absolute. I am one
Yep.
with like the ground of being. I'm one with the entire universe, right? Like that sort of
Yep.
oneness. And on the way there, there's a field of love and intimacy and connection and so forth. And a lot
Through
of
the body. Through the body. Yep.
yeah, a lot of people use the word God to refer to what's happening in that space, but that's not the kind
Yep.
of thing that you were just talking about. So what you were just talking about, I mean, I might be really oversimplifying this, but to me it seems like a lot of externalization of aspects of the psyche that are not being welcomed or being understood, and so they're shoved into the shadow and it turns and they're projected outwardly and then taken to be an external being. That's what I was doing. That a lot of these demons and a lot of these other kinds of like, angels and all sorts of
Yep.
different entities that I was interacting with were, I would say now, externalized aspects of my psyche, right? That I was not able to see as being me, so I was externalizing. So a lot of people, I think, are externalizing their, you know, masculine authoritarian archetypes or their power or their own inherent internal tendencies towards violence or their own internal aspects of the psyche that then are not able to be owned, and so then they're projected outward and seen as an external being. Like this is shadow work 101. I'm not saying anything
Yep.
that's not
Yep.
that's
Yeah.
not
Yeah. Yeah.
been written about by like thousands of people for 100 years, but like that mechanism of externalization, I think it's operating in everybody, right? And it's projecting these shadow parts of yourself out into the world and perceiving them out there. And sometimes they're perceiving them in other people, like, oh, that person, is a problem because of X, Y, and Z, or projected
Mm.
wordly onto, ideas like God or you can just like literally see them as spirits or entities that are external to you, shadows, ghosts, whatever that are external to you.
So,
Uh,
your sense would be that it could be just us, and that's our way of experiencing ourselves, projecting it outwardly to something turning up, like a being or a god, or
Well, so for me, the bottom line with the psyche thread is in the end, this is my understanding of the psyche thread, my definition of the psyche thread is in the end, every single last thing in the cosmos
yeah,
is a projection of your unconscious,
you see through it, right?
it's a projection. It's every last thing, every last moment of perception is there's some kind of, projection happening in order to have that, in order to even perceive that there's some kind of projection
Mm.
happening. And so for me, the bottom of the psyche thread is just seeing that this whole thing is being rendered, right? The whole thing is kind of a virtual reality system that's being rendered, right, for us moment by moment, but the rendering is happening by our own projections,
Yeah.
right? And so at that point, there's nothing that isn't a projection, right?
So this was a big hurdle for me, Pierce, because again, going through my awakening, there was lots of phenomena coming up. Early on, I could have out of body experiences, lucid dreams. Going through the awakening, there was Hindu gods and goddesses turning up, and then at one stage, everything just stopped. I was like, "Where's it gone?" And I was even doing this podcast, and I was always interviewing people, and I was kind of like wondering, maybe somebody has the answer. And it was only until I sat down with Luciano and Rastal. and they explain this Omni Integration phase where they're just all the phenomena just sort of merges as one and it's integrated and you just see through it all.
Yeah, I mean, so that's where their model and my model kind of like coincide at the with this kind of like integration thing. So yeah, so for them they have stages, and so
Yeah.
they like you know, you're now in the integration stage. And for me it's more of a process, you know, there's a beginning and there's an end, but there's also you could be integrating two threads while you're still opening another one, right? So you can have a high level of integration between two or three threads while another one is sort of like just starting. You can have these two threads integrated while these two threads are integrated, but they're not integrated with each other,
With
right?
each other. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's all sorts, for me, there's all kinds of different unique and individual ways that the braiding can turn into integration and that integration can go forward. So I don't call it a stage or a phase, it's more just like a process, but ultimately where that process leads is to this kind of like multidimensional reality, multidimensional multi-perspectival kind of approach where you can perceive all of the realities of the threads being true simultaneously by shifting your stance or shifting your perspective, you know, this way or that way. And so for me, I talked about those four centers. That's what it looked like for me. For you, it looked a little bit different, whatever. I think in their model, they would call that Omni integration. It's the full integration of everything, right? So yeah, and then you're right that so in my model, also in my experience, at the peak of that integration, when everything is fully integrated, then the threads start collapsing, the threads start sort of disappearing as they become fully integrated. You lose the, you know, when something's totally integrated, you lose the ability to separate it out as something
Mm,
that's worth looking at or that is even
yeah.
possible to look at. And so the more integrated something gets, the less relevant and the less obvious and the less you experience it, right? So yeah, so for me it was a falling away of most of the threads at the same time. So I had this experience, you know, going from the peak of, you know, that integration that I was talking about earlier. You really feel like you're totally enlightened when you're in that integration space. You're just like, you know, everything's amazing
Yeah.
and you know, totally empty, totally one, totally energetic, totally, you know, co-creating reality with your mind. You can sort of like, yeah, maybe see these arise where you can sort of like, you know, make reality look like whatever you want it to look like, and you know, it's amazing. And then poof, it sort of, for me, in my case, just kind of all disappeared, mostly all disappeared all at once in one afternoon, and it was just all gone.
Yeah.
But
Back being human, Pierce.
yeah, and then it's like, okay, yeah, you were, you know, the enlightened, you know, you were the enlightened one, and now you're just, you know, just a little old nothing again.
So
Uh,
explain what happens, Pierce, if you can.
well, okay, so I think there's a couple of things that are falling away. And again, I don't want to suggest that it needs to happen all at once because that's how it happened for me. Like I think it can happen, you know, in phases. It can, or it's a process, so it can happen sort of like bit by bit, or it can happen in big chunks, or you know, however it happens. But I think there's a couple of things that are taking place here. So one of them is what I just articulated is the more integrated something becomes, the less it stands out as something to pay attention to. So, you know, if you're looking at the world and seeing oneness, and you're sort of, it's novel, and you're like, wow, everything's one, right? And then you can shift and everything's empty, and it's like, wow, everything's empty. And then you can shift and everything is, you know, co-created with the mind, and then everything is energetic. It seems like that's integrated because you can shift and flow between them. But when it's really actually integrated, you can't separate out one from the other, right? You can't separate out emptiness from oneness, from
Yeah.
energy, psyche, from just like ordinary, how you ordinarily see, ordinary life, just kind of, the fifth pseudo thread that I talk about, that gets interwoven and integrated as well. You can't really separate out things to say whether it's empty or full or one or energetic. It's just kind of like all so integrated together that you're incapable of making those distinctions. And at that point, people start to just say, well, I don't know what reality is like. Like I
Yeah.
can't even really sort of like find a perspective to take to read it to tell you what it's like, because it's just sort of, it's either because it's everything all at once, or it's none of the above, or it's just like the whole idea of trying to observe reality in some way just kind of falls away. So that's one component of what's happening. Is so for some people notice that more than others. Then there's a falling away of the ontologies around that, or the worldviews around that. So when you're doing the awakening process, when you're in the braiding process, when you're, even in the integration process, there can be for people models of reality that they build up. So I experienced oneness with the ground of being, so therefore I create a model of reality where I believe that all of reality is one, right? Or I had some kind of energetic experience where all of reality was flashing in and out, kind of a, a bubble that bursts before it even materializes. And so then I say, well, reality is just unmanifested potential
Yeah.
energy. Or I say, you know, everything is a projection of my mind, and so reality, is from the psyche thread. So all of reality is constructed, co-constructed by my mind, by my psyche, right? Those are all ontologies that people create around the threads. And so with the release of the threads, those ontologies, those realities, those kind of viewpoints that were seen and that were believed at the bottom of each thread now sort of lose their meaningfulness, and it
Mm.
becomes meaningless to try to pin down reality as being like this or like that. Like, is reality, is it energy, or is it empty, or is it,
Yeah.
co-created,
I
or
don't know.
who knows? Who knows? And we don't need to know, right? It's that the whole sort of like project of trying to figure out reality drops. So that's the second thing. So one's perception, two is ontology, and the third thing would be the falling away of the identification that comes
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
threads too,
Yeah.
right? So like earlier I was saying in integration, it's like I am the void, I am the one, I am energy, I am, right? That sort of identification with the positions of the threads, or the perspectives of the threads, those kind of can't stand either. They have to fall as well.
Yeah.
But also the I am this ordinary kind of daily life self, that's long been, shown. You've known that it can't be the case either for a long time. So it's not like you go back to identifying with the pre-awakened little narrative self, because that identification is long gone. But all the other identifications that were so important to the awakening process, right? Those all sort of drop too. And kind of so you're left with no perspective that you can really take, no ontology you can really believe in, no identification you can really hold. And some people, I think, like I have sort of a community of friends that I talk to about these kinds of things. And I've learned sort of how these experiences might happen for different people by talking with others. For me, it was very much like these kinds of, perspective taking, ontology making, and identification. To me, those things, I saw really clearly that those things were an attempt to control at
Mm.
very, very, very subtle level, at a very kind of like moment by moment level, just the act of trying to see reality in one way or another. just the act of trying to perceive anything at all was a means of trying to control the moment. And so when I saw that, it just kind of let go. It just was like, oh, that's control. Poof, like it just let go
Mm.
of itself. And that was my experience of the dropping of the threads or the release of the threads. But other people I know, it was less about sort of them dropping the threads and more about the threads just suddenly disappearing. And they're like, where did my awakening go? Like I want it back. I want to have an ontology. I want to have, to be able to perceive. I want to be able to have, some kind of identity. And so for some people, that transition can be very just like, whoo, just a little subtle relaxation. For other people, it can be a little bit more dramatic with a lot of sort of, you know, maybe some grief, maybe some confusion, maybe some grasping, taking place with the thread, the disappearance of the threads.
So that's fascinating because a couple of months ago, I got to this because I talk about it all the time. I'm always talking about awakening stages, and I just got this feeling of restlessness coming in. I was like, "What am I doing? Who has given me authority to talk about awakening? I do not know anything." And I just woke up one morning. I was like, "I'm done with all of this." I said, "I just feel like I just want to forget it all." And I went out for a walk and it was like the heavens opened up. It was like another awakening. And it was like I woke up from the dream or the dream of awakening. It just,
Yeah.
I seen through it. And it was like, wow, there was never any awakening. And it all just fell away. And I was like, and
Yeah.
then yeah, it was a little bit like, I don't know. I just seen through all the last little nitty gritty little pieces of identity around awakening that I was holding on to. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the the falling away of the threads, right, or the seeing through the threads the way that you just said, I think it exactly like you said, it makes you see that the whole awakening process, it seemed at the time like you extracted yourself out of the
Yeah.
conventional kind of daily life, ego-driven kind of thing. You extracted yourself out of that, and it seemed like you extracted yourself out into what was real, what's really true, and that other thing was an illusion. And then it
Mm,
seems like you just saw more and more of what's really real, right? And so you see reality as empty, you see it as oneness, you see it as energy, you see it as co-constructed with your psyche, and you see you create most people create a sort of the ontologies and the identities around all of this, and oh, awakening has shown me what's real. Awakening has shown me that I was living in a dream world before, and like now I can see all of that. But the release of the threads is seeing that all of that was also an overlay.
also, oh, yes, yes,
Right.
exactly, exactly.
And it's about not instead of like finding a new overlay
Yeah.
to put on to reality, just seeing that, oh, all of it is overlays.
Yes.
And I don't need to have an overlay. Now, that's not to say because now I can see reality how it really is, because that would be an overlay, right? So it's not that. It's not, oh, I can see things so clearly now. It's just like, I don't have to care about how I see things. I don't have to worry or monitor or control how the perceptual process is working and how, what's real and what's not real and how, who sees or who doesn't see, like all of that can just sort of drop.
Yep.
It can
Y-
become irrelevant, and you can just so two implications. I mean, one implication of that for my model is that therefore it doesn't actually matter which threads you opened, how you opened them, how you braided them together, how you integrated them together. Did you have three threads, two threads, one thread, four threads, 1,700 threads? Like none of it matters because all of it just turns out to have been overlays in the end anyway, right? So all of these arguments between people about which awakening process, which
Mm,
practices, which perspectives are right, which ones are wrong, which ones are better, all of it, all of it is irrelevant.
mm,
I mean, what's relevant maybe is that I mean, maybe what's relevant is that we extracted ourselves out of, with the initial awakening process, we extracted ourselves out of some kind of identification with the small separate self and we opened up to this whole world. Great, but if you're fixated in this new world, you're no better or worse than being fixated in the everyday world, right? It's still a fixation. It's still a an overlay. It's still an ontology with an identity, right? So essentially the whole sphere of spirituality, I think, is, arguing over stuff that just doesn't turn out to be important or relevant in the end. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is what's left when you're not taking a perspective, you're not taking an identity, you're not creating ontologies. What's left, I kind of use the metaphor of it's just sort of like autopilot. It's just kind of like a flow state. It's just kind of like you're just living life without separating off a perspective taker who creates ontologies and identities around what's happening. You just kind of like it just kind of like seems to just go with the flow and kind of seems to just happen in a more spontaneous way. I say autopilot because it's like you used to think you were the
yeah, the doer.
pilot of the plane, and now it turns out the plane's flying itself, right? And then it turns out that it was no pilot to begin with. The plane was always flying itself, right? And the thought that there was a pilot was an overlay. It was a
Yeah. And then we're just back, just every day, Joe, living life, but different.
yeah, I mean, just yeah, exactly. So it's 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 just back to your system, right? If you're just running on autopilot, it's basically like just your system's conditioning, just doing what your system does, right? So if your conditioning has I'm a father, I'm a professor, I'm a husband, I'm a friend, there's all kinds of different roles that I play. None of that changes. All
Mm,
those roles are played exactly like they were before. Maybe even better, maybe even like a little bit cleaner because there isn't this sort of like friction in the system created by this little thought loop that's running saying like, oh, this I'm doing this and this means that I'm this kind of person or that kind of person. There's those extra thought loops are gone. Those relationships can maybe run a little bit cleaner. I don't know, but still like the personality is still there.
yeah.
The the preferences are still there, the bad habits are still there, all the conditioning is still there. If anything, the conditioning is just running without any guardrails now because it just is operating sort of freely without some kind of like monitoring function in place. So yeah, so this is like not any kind of special state. It's not any kind of special perspective. It's not any kind of perfection. It's not any kind of like Buddhahood where like all of, it's impossible to have a bad thought ever again. It's none of that. Those are all kind of like, something different. This is
That's
just,
my experience. That's totally my experience. Yeah.
yeah, it's just a completely ordinary life without all the drama,
Yeah.
without all the models and mental kind of added mental loops and overlays.
Pierce, I think we've done a super job. I know we were a
Um,
little bit apprehensive coming into how we were going to approach it, but I think we've nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. I've really enjoyed it. Is there anything I've left out, Pierce, to ask you?
yeah, I want to say one thing with
Yeah, yeah.
more. Well, so first of all, is the other thing that this like thread release state is not is it's not the end of anything because I mean, yeah, maybe it's the end of trying of needing to have ontologies and perspectives and identities, like is the end of that. But it's not the end of learning and
Mm,
growing as a being, right? Even on
yeah.
autopilot, the process of responding to the environment and learning how to better respond and learning how to better communicate and engage with people. There's traumas
That's
and
endless.
other kinds
Yeah.
of things that come up on a daily basis, that can be worked through. Like that stuff, that is endless. So there's no finish line where it's like, other than in mythology, where you have like a Buddha who's like a perfect being who never has any bad feeling, has zero trauma, has zero, you could never do anything wrong ever, right? That's
Mm.
mythology. Just in
Yeah.
in in actual, non-mythological reality, yeah, there's no end to the kind of interaction of this being with the rest of the world, and becoming, better and kinder and gentler and more effective, right? So to me, I always come back to this, and maybe this is because of 20 years spent with like this heart opening process that I said I started with, but to me, like the bottom line is, all of the focus that people put onto spirituality and all the flashy experiences, and all of the threads and the depths of the threads and the perspectives, all of that's going to fall away, right? And what you're going to be left with is just the conditioning in this body and this mind. That's all you're going to be left with in the end. And so to me, like the bottom line is like clean up your shit and learn how to be kind. Like that's it,
Mm. Yeah.
right? Because all the
Don't be a
rest,
dick.
all the rest
Yeah.
is great. All the
Yeah.
rest is great. It's fun, it's amazing, it's beautiful, it's super important for, well, while it's happening. But once it falls away, all you're left with is just like, what kind of conditioning did I bake into this autopilot? What kind of conditioning have I spent 50 years cultivating, right? And if for 50 years you've just cultivated being a jerk, you're going to be an awakened, you're going to be a thread released jerk, right? So yeah, so for me, the bottom line, it just comes down to just, processing your
Being
stuff,
a nice human, right? Just and
processing your
enjoying
stuff,
life.
and learn how to be kind. Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm glad you finished off with that, Pierce. That was beautiful at the end. And I have to say, for me, I really benefited just seeing how everything came to together at the end and kind of dropped away. So I think we did a great job. I
Okay.
mean, amazing. Really, I'm so pleased at how it turned out.
Well, I hope it's helpful for people, and they don't get fixated on my details, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's very useful for people, I think, to see that and kind of like get a kind of a measure of where they okay, is this thread how opening up the psyche thread? See, get my bearings. Amazing, Pierce. Really well done. Thank you so much. I'm going to
Thanks
link
for the opportunity.
to your website, your books. I'll do all that, and I'll link to the other interview, the previous interview we did, where you really went into detail about the threads.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for the
Period.
opportunity.
Honestly, thank you. Thank you. It's been amazing. Okay. Take care, guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
This has been the Endless Possibilities Podcast, where the journey of spiritual awakening and energy healing unfolds. Gareth is a lifelong seeker of truth, a spiritual teacher and author, and it's his passion to delve into the profound world of consciousness. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we hope you've gotten something from it. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, the podcast is available on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms. Find us on Instagram at _mother_force. Take care, and we'll see you soon on the Endless Possibilities Podcast.